It was once taken for granted that abundance was America's birthright: cheap fuel, full tanks, highways open to endless freedom. But in 1973, that illusion crumbled suddenly and quietly. A subtle seismic shift that sent Americans walking back from the edge of prosperity. I'm speaking to you tonight on this late August evening of 2025 in New York, where the city glows in the warmth of summer's fading light. The news these days is cautious. Oil prices hover in uneasy balance. Traders scan for disruptions. And the White House weighs tariffs against allies and rivals alike. Half a century ago, Americans learned this lesson in the most unexpected way. In October 1973, as war erupted in the Middle East, the Arab members of OPEC decided that oil itself would become their weapon. They cut exports, tightened supply, and placed an embargo on nations supporting Israel. Almost overnight, the price of a single barrel of crude leapt from barely $3 to more than $11. It was a surge, not born of markets, but of politics. And for millions of ordinary Americans, the shock was immediate and deeply personal. Gasoline, once abundant and cheap, turned into something rare and precious. Long lines of cars stretched down suburban avenues and city blocks. Drivers arrived before dawn, hoping to reach the pump before it ran dry. Some carried cans in their trunks. Others argued and honked in frustration. Tempers flared, fights broke out, and in some places police were called simply to keep order at filling stations. Imagine living in the wealthiest country in the world, yet returning home after hours of waiting with nothing but an empty tank and a sour taste of powerlessness. It was more than inconvenience, it was a wound to national pride. For decades, Americans had celebrated the open road as a symbol of freedom, the sprawling interstate highway system as proof of boundless opportunity. To see that freedom constrained, not by choice, but by scarcity, was humiliating. The nation discovered that it was not as independent as it believed, and that its prosperity could be held hostage by events oceans away. Economically, the shock opened the door to a strange new era. Inflation rose even as growth slowed, creating the dreaded word stagflation. Policymakers struggled for answers. Gas rationing was debated, speed limits were imposed, and the government launched Project Independence, vowing that the United States would never again be vulnerable to foreign oil. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was established, vast caverns of storage to guard against future crises. These measures linger even today, quiet monuments to a season when the pumps went dry. And yet, for all the changes, the vulnerability remained. That is why in 2025, when we hear about oil prices shifting with every tariff announcement, or when headlines warn of shipping disruptions and distant wars, the echoes feel so familiar. History does not repeat itself precisely, but it rhymes, often enough to unsettle the mind. So tonight, as New York's lights sparkle against the August night sky, we step gently back into that moment. The oil crisis of 1973 was not just an episode of inconvenience, but a revelation of fragility. It showed how quickly prosperity could be interrupted, how swiftly certainty could dissolve, and how deeply energy binds together every part of modern life. Stay with me, for the story begins in those endless gas lines of autumn, and carries forward into lessons we are still struggling to learn today. When we think of crises, we often picture sudden disasters: a crash on Wall Street, a war breaking out, a natural calamity tearing through towns. But the oil crisis of 1973 did not begin with explosions or collapsing banks. It unfolded quietly, through the subtle act of nations deciding that barrels of oil could serve as political weapons. The United States, used to abundance, woke one morning to find that its lifeblood, the gasoline that powered its cars, trucks, factories, and very sense of freedom, was suddenly scarce. What followed was not a single event, but a season of tension, marked by long lines at filling stations, price signs that seemed to change by the week, and a growing awareness that the age of cheap, limitless energy was over. If you're enjoying this quiet journey into history, take a moment now to subscribe. Helps us bring you more stories like this one. To understand the story, one must picture America in the early 1970s. The nation was still basking in the glow of its post-war dominance, though shadows had begun to gather. The Vietnam War had drained confidence. The dollar was trembling after Nixon severed its link to gold, and inflation was already nibbling at household budgets. Yet for most Americans, daily life still ran on the assumption that fuel would always be plentiful. Vacations meant long road trips. Suburban living required commuting by car, and the hum of engines filled every corner of the economy. It was precisely this dependence that made the crisis so unsettling, for it revealed how vulnerable the superpower had become to decisions made far away. The trigger came in October 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, when the United States backed Israel. Arab oil producers responded with an embargo, cutting supplies to America and its allies. Almost overnight, oil prices quadrupled. The world's richest nation found itself rationing a commodity it had never imagined running out of. People waited for hours in lines that sometimes ended in frustration. Gas stations closed early or limited purchases to a few gallons. A strange new etiquette developed. Neighbors trading tips on which stations might have fuel. Families planning errands around the likelihood of shortages. Tempers tested as ordinary routines turned into exhausting ordeals. But this was more than a matter of inconvenience. The shortage rippled through every layer of society. Truckers demanded higher wages to cover their costs. Factories slowed production, and inflation surged. Policymakers faced a dilemma unlike any before: how to respond to rising prices and stagnant growth at the same time. Out of this period came new words in the American vocabulary: stagflation, energy dependence, and conservation. The government introduced speed limits meant to save fuel, called on citizens to reduce consumption, and launched ambitious projects to free the country from foreign oil. Some of these measures succeeded, others faded, but the psychological impact was lasting. Americans had been forced to confront the limits of abundance. As with so many historical episodes, the oil crisis was not only about economics, but also about identity. For a society that had celebrated the car as a symbol of independence, the inability to drive freely struck at something deeper than convenience. It revealed how fragile freedom could be when tied to the whims of geopolitics. It also altered America's place in the world, as the balance of power shifted toward oil-producing nations, who suddenly held leverage over the West. What had seemed like peripheral players in global politics became central figures, their decisions watched with the same intensity once reserved for superpower rivalries. If this resonates with you, don't forget to press like it. Lets us know you want more of these calm, yet thought-provoking journeys. Looking back from 2025, the crisis seems both distant and strangely close. Distant, because the images of cars idling in endless lines belong to another age of flared pants and analog radios. Close, because the same forces conflict in the Middle East. Debates about energy security, the volatility of global markets still shape our daily lives, just as families once adjusted their routines around uncertain gas supplies. Households today measure their budgets against the unpredictable costs of energy, and just as policymakers once vowed to achieve independence, leaders now balance between fossil fuels and renewables, between immediate needs and long-term sustainability. The oil crisis of 1973 was more than a moment of scarcity. It was a mirror held up to America, showing vulnerabilities that prosperity had long concealed. It revealed how quickly confidence could collapse, how tightly economies are bound together, and how even the most powerful nations can be humbled by events beyond their control. It set in motion decades of policies, from the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to the slow but steady investment in alternative energy. Most of all, it left behind a lingering awareness that abundance should never be taken for granted. And so, as we prepare to walk through the story in detail, the shock of the embargo, the struggles of ordinary families, the policy battles in Washington, and the long-term consequences that still ripple through our world, we do so not merely to recount the past, but to listen for its echoes in the present. The gas lines of 1973 may be long gone, but their shadow still lingers every time markets tremble, every time prices rise, every time nations discover that energy is not just fuel, but fate. So stay close, leave a comment if you're still with me, and let's step together into the first chapter of this long night in American history. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, America emerged not only as a victor, but as a nation transformed. Factories that had once produced tanks and bombers shifted to automobiles and refrigerators, and a generation of young soldiers returned home with a hunger for comfort, stability, and the promise of mobility. Unlike the shattered cities of Europe or the struggling economies of Asia, the United States brimmed with optimism. Prosperity, it seemed, was no longer a dream, but an expectation. And at the heart of this new chapter stood the automobile. The car had existed for decades before, of course, but in the years after the war, it became something greater than a machine. It was a symbol of freedom, of self-expression, of the new American lifestyle. A Chevrolet parked in the driveway of a modest suburban home was a sign that the American dream had not only survived the Great Depression and the war, but had blossomed into something tangible. Children piled into station wagons for Sunday picnics. Teenagers tested the limits of speed on quiet rural roads, and families began to imagine vacations, not bound by train schedules, but by the open road. This love affair with cars was more than cultural, it was economic. The auto industry employed hundreds of thousands directly and millions indirectly, fueling steel, rubber, glass, and petroleum. Highways pulsed with commercial traffic, delivering goods that fed a growing consumer economy. Gasoline stations sprouted along every route, offering not just fuel, but snacks, maps, and the reassuring glow of neon signs. For a society eager to leave behind the hardships of ration books and blackout curtains, the sight of brightly lit filling stations promised abundance without end. What made this moment unique was not just the car itself, but the way it redefined space. Suburbs expanded outward from cities, their tidy rows of homes made possible by affordable automobiles. To live in a cul-de-sac in Levittown or the new developments of California was no longer isolation, it was liberation, made possible by the reliable family sedan. Entire communities sprang up with the assumption that every household would own not one, but eventually 2 cars. This assumption, so natural today, was revolutionary then, and it carried profound consequences for the nation's dependence on oil. Petroleum, once merely another industrial commodity, became the silent backbone of American life. With every mile driven, every summer road trip, every truck that delivered food to grocery stores, the country deepened its reliance on cheap and plentiful fuel. And because domestic oil production, while vast, was not infinite, the gap between consumption and supply began to widen quietly in the background. Few noticed it at first. The 1950s and early 1960s seemed to offer nothing but growth. Factories roared, wages climbed, and cars rolled off assembly lines in dazzling chrome. Each new model promising more power, more comfort, more freedom. Culturally, too, the car embedded itself in the American psyche. Music celebrated it, from rock and roll ballads about cruising to country songs about pickup trucks. Movies glamorized the open road, with James Dean leaning against his vehicle as if it were an extension of his soul. Even advertising sold more than horsepower. It sold the idea that cars could define identity. To be young and without a car was to be incomplete, while to own one was to declare independence from parents, neighbors, and limitations, yet beneath. The shine and chrome vulnerabilities were quietly forming. By the mid-1960s, signs of strain began to appear. Domestic oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma were reaching maturity, while consumption continued to climb. The number of cars on the road soared past 70 million by 1960, and gasoline consumption doubled compared to pre-war levels. Highways were clogged, suburbs sprawled endlessly, and the very success of the American dream ensured that the country's appetite for oil grew insatiable. But because gasoline remained cheap, just a few cents per gallon, few questioned the sustainability of such a system. In hindsight, it is easy to see that this love affair was built on fragile foundations. The more cars Americans drove, the more the nation's economy, culture, and politics became intertwined with the steady flow of oil. And because oil flowed easily from both domestic fields and friendly producers abroad, dependency did not feel like vulnerability. It felt like destiny. But history has a way of revealing the costs of complacency, and the years of exuberant driving, chrome-plated optimism, and unquestioned abundance set the stage for the shock that would arrive in 1973. For now, though, in the glow of post-war prosperity, Americans believed they had conquered scarcity once and for all. The car was their proof, gasoline their lifeblood, and the open road their symbol of freedom. Few could imagine that within a single generation, lines of cars would stretch endlessly, not in celebration, but in desperation, as the same machines that symbolized abundance became prisoners of shortage. If the car was the heart of post-war America, then the interstate highway system became its arteries. In 1956, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, few ordinary Americans realized just how much it would reshape their lives. The legislation promised more than 41,000 miles of new roads, an ambitious network that would stitch together the vast expanse of the United States. To many, it seemed simply a practical measure, a way to move goods, troops, and families more efficiently. But in practice, it transformed not only how Americans traveled, but how they lived, where they lived, and even how they thought about distance and community. The new highways sliced across farmland, cut through old neighborhoods, and carved paths around city centers. Suddenly, the long trip from one state to another was no longer a journey of winding back roads, but a streamlined dash on wide concrete ribbons. For truckers, this meant faster deliveries and larger loads. For families, it meant vacations in distant states, weekend getaways, and the confidence that one could always return home by simply following the bright green signs. And for suburban developers, it meant that distance was no longer an obstacle, but an opportunity. Suburbs had begun to grow before the highway boom, fueled by the GI Bill and the dream of homeownership. But with the interstate system, their growth became exponential. A worker could live 20 or 30 miles from the city, enjoying a yard, a garage, and the illusion of pastoral peace, while still commuting daily to an office downtown. Developers, like William Levitt, pioneered mass-produced housing, offering tidy homes at affordable prices, each one designed with a driveway ready for the family car. By the early 1960s, the suburban lifestyle had become not just an option, but an expectation. The model for millions of middle-class Americans. Cars and highways worked together in a feedback loop. The more roads were built, the more people moved to the suburbs. The more people moved, the more cars were purchased. The more cars were purchased, the more roads were demanded. Gasoline stations multiplied to meet the surge. Rest stops appeared with diners and motels, and the hum of engines became the background noise of daily life. The automobile ceased to be a luxury and became a necessity. Without one, suburban families were stranded, cut off from jobs, schools, and shopping centers. Dependency on the car meant dependency on the fuel that kept it alive, though few paused to reflect on this growing vulnerability. There was also a cultural irony at play. The very highways meant to connect communities often ended up dividing them. Inner-city neighborhoods were split by concrete barriers, displacing families and businesses, while suburban expansion drained cities of their tax base and vitality. Yet Americans celebrated the convenience and freedom, convinced that a few gallons of cheap gasoline could erase any problem of distance. To question the sustainability of this model was to sound joyless, perhaps even unpatriotic, in a nation that equated driving with progress. By the late 1960s, the statistics told a dramatic story. The number of cars per household had doubled compared to the immediate post-war years. Commuting distances lengthened, traffic jams became a daily ritual, and the oil industry thrived. Demand for gasoline surged relentlessly, and with it, imports of foreign oil began to climb. Domestic fields, though still productive, could not keep pace with the nation's appetite. The United States, once comfortably self-sufficient, was sliding almost unnoticed into dependence on oil from abroad. It is tempting, in hindsight, to view this as reckless short-sightedness, but at the time, it felt like inevitability. Few could imagine life without highways, or the car-based lifestyle they enabled. The suburbs represented safety, prosperity, and upward mobility. The long driveway with two cars parked side by side became a badge of success, even if it tethered families ever more tightly to the fluctuations of global oil markets. The interstate system did more than pave roads. It paved expectations. It taught Americans to assume that mobility was limitless, that distance could always be conquered, and that gasoline would always be waiting at the corner station. The oil crisis of 1973 would later shatter these assumptions. But in the years of expansion, when engines roared and suburbs spread, no one wanted to hear about limits. Progress was measured in miles of asphalt and gallons consumed, and the country charged ahead as if the road would never end. By the mid-1960s, America's love affair with the automobile and the sprawling highways had matured into something more complicated: dependence. Consumption of oil surged year after year, climbing like a graph that refused to bend, while domestic production quietly began to plateau. The great gushers of Texas and Oklahoma, once symbols of endless bounty, were aging. Wells that had seemed inexhaustible in the roaring 20s and wartime 40s were no longer yielding with the same vigor. Yet the appetite of a nation that now counted over 100 million registered vehicles only grew more insistent. Gasoline was the obvious drain, but it was hardly the only one. Oil-fueled airplanes that now carried millions of Americans across the continent, cargo ships that delivered imports to bustling ports, and petrochemical plants that supplied plastics, fertilizers, and countless everyday goods. The nation's prosperity was literally built on petroleum. To live in the United States of the 1960s was to be surrounded by products that, in one way or another, came from oil. From synthetic fabrics to suburban lawns fed by chemical fertilizers. The black liquid underpinned both the necessities and the luxuries of modern life. Statistics told the tale starkly. Between 1945 and 1970, American oil consumption more than doubled, while domestic production increased only modestly. By the early 1970s, imports supplied roughly a third of the nation's NENZA figure. That seemed manageable at the time, but marked a profound shift from earlier decades, when the U.S. had been the world's leading exporter. In fact, just a generation earlier, American oil had fueled the Allies' victory in World War II. Now, astonishingly quickly, the United States was leaning on foreign suppliers to sustain its prosperity. The irony did not go unnoticed among energy experts and policymakers. Committees in Washington issued cautious reports, warning that dependence on foreign oil could pose risks if geopolitical conditions changed. But the warnings were often drowned out by the roar of engines on interstates and the optimism of a consumer culture that measured progress in horsepower. Oil was cheap, the economy was strong, and the idea that supply might be interrupted seemed distant, almost academic. Who wanted to spoil the suburban barbecue with talk of depletion curves? Domestic producers, too, began to feel the squeeze. The famed Texas Railroad Commission, which for decades had managed production levels to stabilize prices, found itself losing influence as foreign producers, particularly in the Middle East, expanded output at lower costs. The balance of power in global oil markets was shifting subtly, but unmistakably away from the United States. American dominance was giving way to a new cartel, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, founded in 1960 but only beginning to flex its muscles by the decade's end. Ordinary Americans, of course, noticed little of this. To them, the oil industry remained a distant abstraction. What mattered was that gasoline was still cheap, often less than 40 cents a gallon, and stations still competed with giveaways, offering glassware, toys, and promotions simply to attract customers. Drivers grumbled about traffic jams, not about fuel supplies. The very idea that they might one day line up for hours, only to be turned away empty-handed, seemed unimaginable. Yet the numbers were undeniable. Domestic crude oil production peaked in 1970 at about 9.6 million barrels per day, and began to decline afterward. Meanwhile, consumption kept climbing, pushed by population growth, suburban sprawl, and the ceaseless allure of bigger cars. The muscle cars of the late 1960s Thunderbirds, Mustangs, and GTOs were adored for their power, but devoured fuel at rates that made today's SUVs seem modest. The contradiction was clear. Americans were demanding more oil precisely, as their own wells were producing less. This imbalance planted the seeds of vulnerability. Every imported barrel tied the nation more tightly to political conditions abroad. Each new highway exit, each new suburban driveway, deepened the dependence on foreign fields whose names most Americans could not pronounce. Yet in the moment, it did not feel like fragility. It felt like progress. The abundance of the 1950s and 60s had created a cultural blind spot, a belief that the future would always resemble the present, that cheap energy was as natural as air and water. Looking back, one can almost hear the engine idling on the edge of crisis. The gauges were already flashing warning signs: declining domestic supply, rising imports, political turbulence in the Middle East, but the driver kept pressing the accelerator. The road ahead seemed smooth, wide, and infinite. Only later would Americans discover that they had been speeding toward a cliff, their tanks filled with oil that was not truly their own. If the 1950s had been the decade of America's highways and booming suburbs, the 1960s quietly belonged to a different set of players' nations, far from Washington, Detroit, or Dallas, yet increasingly able to tug at the strings of America's prosperity. In 1960, representatives from Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela met in Baghdad to form what seemed at first a modest alliance, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Few in the West paid much attention at the time. Oil was cheap, abundant, and largely managed by the great multinational firms known as the Seven Sisters: Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, and their kin. To policymakers in Washington or London, the idea that a handful of producer states might challenge this order seemed improbable, even faintly comic, but history delights in irony. As the decade unfolded, OPEC grew in strength, joined by new members, such as Qatar, Indonesia, and Libya. These nations shared not only geology, the luck of sitting atop vast petroleum reserves, but also a simmering frustration at how little control they exercised over their own resources. For decades, foreign companies had extracted their oil, set the prices, and walked away with much of the profit. The OPEC states, newly independent in many cases, saw oil not merely as revenue but as sovereignty. By banding together, they hoped to reclaim power from the corporations that had long dictated terms. At first, OPEC's influence was limited. Meetings produced statements more than results, and Western firms continued to dominate. Yet the balance was beginning to shift. Nationalism surged in the Middle East and beyond as leaders discovered that oil could serve as both economic lifeline and political weapon. In 1969, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya famously drove a hard bargain with foreign companies, raising the price of Libyan oil and setting a precedent that others quickly followed. Soon producers were demanding higher royalties, greater shares of profits, and more say in determining prices. For the United States, these changes were easy to ignore, while domestic supply still met much of its demand. But by the late 1960s, as imports rose steadily, the mood grew more anxious. Each barrel shipped across oceans carried with it not only crude oil, but the potential for political leverage. It was no longer unthinkable that producers might use supply as a bargaining chip. Analysts in Washington began to speak of producer power with a seriousness absent a decade earlier. OPEC, for its part, learned to wield its newfound clout with increasing confidence. The Arab members, in particular, saw oil as a tool in their broader struggles with Israel and the West. The Yom Kippur War still lay a few years ahead, but the outlines of future confrontation were already visible. In speeches and conferences, leaders hinted that oil was not just a commodity, but a weapon, a statement that many in the West dismissed as bluster. Yet in hindsight, the warnings were anything but idle. This shift was not purely political. It was also mathematical. The sheer scale of Middle Eastern reserves was staggering. Saudi Arabia alone held proven reserves that dwarfed those of the United States. As American production peaked in 1970 and began its slow decline, OPEC's reserves looked less like a curiosity and more like the future. For oil companies, access to these reserves became essential. For governments, dependence on these nations became inevitable. And for OPEC, leverage grew with every passing year. Of course, ordinary Americans remained blissfully unaware of these tectonic shifts. They filled their tanks, admired the latest muscle cars, and complained about traffic without sparing a thought for a meeting hall in Vienna, where OPEC ministers debated quotas. The idea that these distant gatherings might one day determine whether gas stations in Ohio or California ran dry seemed absurd. Yet the machinery of change was already humming. By uniting, producers were learning how to turn geology into geopolitics. The rise of OPEC in the 1960s is a reminder of how power often shifts unnoticed until it is undeniable. What began as a modest declaration in Baghdad became, within little more than a decade, the fulcrum of global energy. And while Washington still assumed it held the levers, the reality was that control was slipping quietly away. The oil that fueled America's cars, planes, and factories was increasingly governed by nations with their own agendas, their own rivalries, and their own sense of history. In the calm of the 1960s, as neon signs flickered at gas stations and families planned summer road trips, the seeds of crisis were already being sown. OPEC was no longer a curious footnote. It was becoming the stage on which the drama of the 1970s would play out. By the early 1970s, the American economy seemed to move with the confidence of a giant, but the ground beneath its feet was already shifting. President Richard Nixon, who entered the White House in 1969, inherited not only the turmoil of Vietnam and the social unrest of a divided nation, but also an economy straining under new kinds of pressure. Inflation was creeping upward. Deficits swelled with the costs of war and domestic programs, and the confidence that had once defined the dollar was beginning to fray. In a way, it was not just cars that consumed more than they produced. America itself was doing the same. For a quarter century, the world's financial system had rested on the Bretton Woods Agreement, which tied the US dollar to gold and other currencies to the dollar. The arrangement reflected America's post-war dominance. The dollar was as good as gold, and other nations trusted it. But by the late 1960s, this foundation grew unstable. Foreign governments, worried about America's mounting deficits, began to convert dollars into gold. Reserves dwindled. In 1971, Nixon stunned the world by closing the gold window, ending the dollar's direct convertibility. Overnight, the system that had underpinned global finance unraveled. This moment, sometimes called the Nixon shock, marked more than a financial shift. It symbolized the fragility of American confidence. For ordinary citizens, the news felt abstract, something about gold and foreign banks. But its consequences soon touched daily life. Inflation accelerated, the value of the dollar wobbled, and the sense of prosperity that had defined the 1950s and 60s no longer felt invincible. The dollar was no longer anchored. It floated on the tides of global markets, just as oil prices would soon float with politics. If you enjoy these small details of history that ripple into everyday life, don't forget to subscribe. Helps us keep telling the story in this calm and steady way. Meanwhile, Nixon wrestled with energy policy in ways that, in hindsight, seem like foreshadowing. Domestic oil production had peaked in 1970, and imports rose steadily. Reports warned of dependence on the Middle East, but Nixon's administration, preoccupied with Vietnam, détente with the Soviet Union, and the opening to China, treated oil as a manageable concern rather than an existential risk. Price controls were imposed in 1971 to curb inflation, including on gasoline, a policy that would later worsen shortages when demand rose faster than supply. The irony was almost cruel. In trying to shield Americans from rising prices, the government set the stage for long lines at gas stations when the crunch came. By 1972, the contradictions piled up. Americans were driving more miles than ever, often in cars that guzzled fuel with indifference. Suburbs expanded further, highways stretched longer, and oil imports accounted for more than a third of U.S. consumption. At the same time, the dollar's weakness made imports more costly. Inflation eroded purchasing power, and political tensions abroad simmered. The Yom Kippur War was still a year away, but the fuse was already lit. The United States stood exposed, dependent on foreign oil, reliant on a shaky currency, and governed by policies that underestimated how quickly circumstances could turn. Nixon himself projected confidence, as was his style. He spoke of American resilience, of independence, of the nation's ability to weather challenges. But behind the speeches, vulnerability lurked. The so-called energy independence that presidents would later promise was already a mirage. In truth, the country had built a lifestyle and an economy that required more oil than it could produce, and it had tied its prosperity to global markets it did not control. For a superpower accustomed to dictating terms, this was a quiet but profound shift. There is a kind of tragic humor in this moment. Americans celebrated their new freedom from the gold standard, as if it meant unlimited possibilities, while at the same time chaining themselves to the whims of oil exporters. The dollar floated, but the cars still ran on gasoline, and every gallon tied the economy more firmly to the Middle East. Nixon had freed America from gold, but he could not free it from petroleum. And so, as 1973 approached, the stage was set. The interstate highways hummed with traffic, suburbs sprawled further each year, and imports filled the gap left by declining domestic wells. The dollar had lost its golden anchor, Inflation was stirring, and policymakers tinkered with price controls that made little sense in practice. All it would take was a spark of war, a political decision, a moment of leverage for the illusion of abundance to collapse. That spark would come in October, and when it did, Americans would discover just how fragile their prosperity had become. So before we move into that autumn storm, take a breath with me. If you're still awake and listening closely, leave a simple one in the comments. It's our quiet way of knowing you're still with us on this long road through history. On the morning of October 6, 1973, while much of America enjoyed the calm of an autumn weekend, halfway across the world, an event unfolded that would soon reshape the rhythm of daily life in the United States. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, when many Israelis were at prayer or resting. On that afternoon, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack across the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights, catching Israel off guard. The war that followed, brief but fierce, did not stay confined to the battlefield. Its consequences rippled outward, reaching gas stations in Ohio, freeways in California, and kitchens in New York. For the Arab states, the war was more than military. It was political, emotional, and existential. The humiliation of 1967's Six-Day War still burned, and leaders like Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Syria's Hafez al-Assad sought not only territorial recovery, but symbolic redemption. As tanks rolled and jets roared, another battle was already being prepared in the meeting rooms of OPEC and the Arab Liga. Battle not fought with weapons, but with oil. The decision to weaponize oil emerged from a mix of pragmatism and outrage. The United States, though not a direct combatant, provided Israel with critical military aid once the war began. For the Arab producers, this support was intolerable. They believed that if the West insisted on backing Israel, then the West would have to feel the costs not in distant politics, but in daily life. And so, for the first time on such a scale, oil was chosen as the instrument of retaliation. The logic was simple, yet devastating. By restricting supply, raising prices, and targeting embargoes against specific nations, producers could transform energy from a mere commodity into a weapon of geopolitical pressure. Unlike guns or tanks, this weapon could reach across oceans without leaving a single battlefield. It could idle engines, disrupt economies, and test the patience of entire societies. In the weeks that followed, Arab oil ministers coordinated their moves with surprising unity. On October 17, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC announced they would cut production by 5% each month until their political demands were met. More dramatically, they declared a full embargo on nations seen as friendly to Israel, including the United States and the Netherlands. This was not the first time producers had grumbled about politics, but it was the first time they acted with such discipline, precision, and timing. In Washington, the news landed like a thunderclap. At first, some officials dismissed the threats as bluff or temporary posturing. After all, America had long assumed that it could dictate terms to oil producers, not the other way around. But as ships slowed, deliveries thinned, and prices ticked upward, the reality became undeniable. Oil, once cheap and taken for granted, had suddenly become scarce and costly, not because of geology, but because of politics. The weaponization of oil was revolutionary, not just for its immediate impact, but for the precedent it set. It revealed to the world that the producers of the Middle East held real leverage over the industrial powers. It showed that barrels could speak louder than bullets, and it underscored how vulnerable the United States had become after decades of rising consumption and declining domestic production. The grand highways, the sprawling suburbs, the roaring engine saw, were now exposed to decisions made thousands of miles away. There is a quiet drama in this moment. While soldiers fought on desert sands, American families had no inkling that their Thanksgiving plans would soon be shaped by fuel shortages. Children played in suburban yards, unaware that their parents would spend hours waiting in gas lines before Christmas. The Yom Kippur War lasted less than 3 weeks, but the oil embargo it triggered would reverberate for months, even years, across American life. By deciding to wield oil as a weapon, the Arab producers had changed the rules of the game. No longer was energy simply a matter of markets and companies. It was now entangled with diplomacy, war, and ideology. The stage was set for one of the most disruptive economic shocks of the 20th century, a crisis that would remind Americans that their abundance rested not on inevitability, but on fragile and shifting sands. If the decision to weaponize oil was born in the heat of the Yom Kippur War, its execution depended on unities, something that the oil-producing nations had not always achieved. For years, OPEC had been a club of uneasy partners, sharing interests but divided by politics, rivalries, and differing ambitions. Yet in the autumn of 1973, those divisions seemed to fade, replaced by a remarkable cohesion. Arab producers in particular understood that their strength lay not in acting alone, but in moving together. And for a time, they did. The mechanics of the embargo were as deliberate as they were disruptive. On October 17, 1973, Arab oil ministers, meeting in Kuwait, announced that production would be cut by 5% each month until Israel withdrew from occupied territories. More importantly, they imposed a full embargo on nations seen as supporting Israel, chief among them the United States and the Netherlands. Other Western nations, such as Japan and many in Western Europe, were left to reconsider their diplomatic positions under the implicit threat of losing access to oil. It was diplomacy by scarcity, a tactic as simple as it was effective. Almost overnight, the flow of crude slowed to a trickle. Oil tankers, once symbols of abundance, became instruments of pressure. Some shipments were redirected, others withheld entirely. The statistics tell the story with stark clarity. Within a few months, oil prices had quadrupled, climbing from around $3 a barrel to more than $11. For the global economy, accustomed to stability, it was as if gravity itself had shifted. What made the embargo so effective was not only the reduction in supply, but the psychological effect of uncertainty. Importers could no longer assume that oil would arrive steadily, predictably, as it had for decades. Instead, every cargo became a question mark, every shipment a negotiation. Markets, which thrive on predictability, panicked. Futures soared, governments scrambled, and consumers, watching the numbers rise at their local gas stations, began to feel the pressure in their daily lives. In Washington, the unity of OPEC came as a shock. Officials had long assumed that rivalries between producers Arab versus Persian, conservative monarchies versus revolutionary republics, would prevent them from sustaining collective action. And indeed, OPEC would later fracture under the weight of its contradictions. But in 1973, fueled by shared anger and political urgency, the producers held together long enough to make their point unmistakably clear. Oil could be wielded as a collective weapon. For the United States, this unity carried an extra sting. It revealed that the leverage was no longer in American hands. For decades, companies based in New York, Houston, and London had dictated terms to the producing nations, deciding prices, setting quotas, and enjoying the lion's share of profits. Now, the tables had turned. The producers were dictating, and the industrial powers were forced to listen. It was a reversal so profound that it shook the very identity of a superpower accustomed to control. Ordinary Americans, of course, did not follow the minutes of meetings in Vienna or Kuwait. What they saw were the consequences. Lines at gas stations, rising prices, and occasional signs reading "sorry. No gas today." But behind those signs lay a carefully coordinated campaign, managed by ministers who understood that their unity could transform local grievances into global leverage. For the first time, they tasted the thrill of dictating terms to Washington and its allies. And for the first time, Washington had little choice but to respond. There is a certain irony in how the mechanics of the embargo operated. It required no armies, no invasions, no dramatic clashes, only meetings, announcements, and a disciplined reduction in output. Yet the impact of those decisions reverberated more powerfully than many wars. They revealed that in the 20th century, sovereignty could be defended not only with weapons but with wells, not only with soldiers but with barrels. As weeks turned into months, OPEC's unity began to fray, as it always did. Some nations worried about lost revenues, others about their own domestic needs. But the damage was already done. The embargo had proven the concept. It had shown that the world's industrial powers were not invulnerable, that their economies could be squeezed, and that their consumers could be made to feel the discomfort of geopolitical decisions. The mechanics of the embargo were, in a sense, simple, but the lesson they carried was profound. The age of cheap, guaranteed energy was over, and in its place had arrived an era in which oil was not just fuel, but a tool of strategy. A bargaining chip as potent as any missile or treaty. The world would never look at a barrel of crude the same way again. In the autumn of 1973, the numbers began to climb with a speed that seemed almost unreal. For decades, oil had been the very picture of stability, hovering at a few dollars a barrel, its price as steady and unquestioned as the rising sun. Families planned their budgets around it without a second thought. Businesses built their models on its reliability, and governments assumed it would always be there, quietly abundant. But within a matter of weeks, that illusion shattered. The price of oil, which had lingered at roughly $3 a barrel for years, suddenly vaulted past 11. It was not a gradual rise, but a jolt, as if the world economy had been struck by an unseen tremor. For the average American, the meaning of these numbers took time to sink in. On Wall Street, analysts gasped at the charts, but on Main Street, the shock was measured not in barrels, but in gallons. Gasoline prices at the pump surged by more than a third, and for drivers, accustomed to filling their tanks for pocket change, the difference was glaring. A dollar no longer stretched as it once had. The same drive to work, the same weekly errands, the same family trip to visit relatives demanded more money. It was as if every journey now carried a hidden toll. This was not inflation in the ordinary sense. Americans had lived with rising prices before, but what made the oil shock unique was its speed and its reach. The sudden surge in costs rippled outward into every sector of the economy. Trucks that hauled food to supermarkets now demanded higher fuel budgets. Airlines raised ticket prices, factories adjusted their operations, and even schools struggled with heating bills. In a society so deeply tied to petroleum, the quadrupling of oil prices was like a stone thrown into a pond, sending concentric waves in every direction. For policymakers in Washington, the explosion was both humiliating and terrifying. The United States, once the world's great oil producer, now found itself at the mercy of decisions made in Riyadh, Tehran, and Tripoli. Diplomats scrambled to persuade, cajole, and negotiate, but the producers held their ground. Each barrel withheld or rerouted carried political weight, and each week that passed made it clear that the age of American dominance in oil markets was over. What startled many observers was not only the size of the price increase, but its permanence. Even when the embargo eventually eased, prices never returned to their former lows. The floor had shifted upward, and with it, the cost of living. The 1970s became a decade marked by energy anxiety, as consumers realized that the era of endlessly cheap gasoline was gone for good. The long tail of that autumn shock stretched across years, reshaping habits, policies, and expectations. And yet, amid the panic, there was also a strange kind of disbelief. Some Americans clung to the hope that this was temporary, a passing storm that would soon fade. After all, the nation had weathered recessions, wars, and depressions before. Surely the gas pumps would return to normal. But as weeks stretched into months, and as prices remained stubbornly high, the realization dawned that something fundamental had changed. The quadrupling of oil prices was not just a statistic on an economic report, it was a psychological turning point. It shattered the assumption that resources would always be plentiful and cheap. It reminded Americans that their prosperity was bound to global forces beyond their control. And it revealed the uncomfortable truth that the machines of modern life, from cars to factories to airplanes, could be halted not by bombs but by barrels. Looking back, one can almost hear the quiet gasp of a society awakening from its long dream of abundance. The sudden leap from $3 to $11 was more than a change in numbers. It was a jolt of reality, a reminder that even empires could be humbled by scarcity. It was the moment when oil ceased to be a background commodity and became, unmistakably, a matter of destiny. If the price charts and economic reports showed the crisis in numbers, the gas lines revealed it in flesh and blood. For millions of Americans, the oil shock was not something they read in newspapers, but something they lived on chilly mornings and restless afternoons, sitting in cars that crept forward inch by inch toward a pump that might already be dry. The gas line became the defining image of the crisis, a symbol not just of scarcity, but of helplessness, frustration, and the erosion of confidence in everyday life. In suburbs across the country, the ritual began before dawn. Drivers woke early, hoping to beat the crowds, only to find dozens of headlights already glowing in the pre-dawn darkness, lined up outside the nearest filling station. Parents sat with thermoses of coffee, children drowsy in the back seats, engines idling as the line inched forward. Some stations limited purchases to 10 gallons. Others refused to serve anyone whose license plate didn't match the Adorvan rationing rules that some states imposed. The rules varied by region, but the uncertainty was universal. Would there be enough fuel when your turn came? The stories from those lines carried a mix of humor and despair. Newspapers published anecdotes of fights breaking out when drivers tried to cut ahead, of neighbors shouting across rows of cars, of friendships strained by the stress of waiting. Police were sometimes dispatched to keep order, not over protests or riots, but over queues for gasoline. In New Jersey, a station owner posted a handwritten sign, "Don't honk, we're out too." In California, motorists brought lawn chairs to sit beside their cars during long waits, turning the gas line into a reluctant social gathering. For truckers, the stakes were even higher. Long-haul drivers found their livelihoods threatened as diesel grew scarce and expensive. Some staged protests, parking their rigs along highways in symbolic blockades, demanding relief from Washington. For small businesses, the crisis was not an inconvenience, but a blow to survival. Deliveries slowed, costs mounted, and in some cases, shelves emptied. What had once been invisible, the simple assumption that fuel would always be there, suddenly became painfully visible in its absence. There was also the humiliation. Americans had long prided themselves on abundance, on being the land where scarcity belonged to other nations. To wait for hours only to be told the station had run dry was more than an annoyance. It was a reminder that even a superpower could be reduced to begging for a basic necessity. Photographs of cars snaking around blocks became international symbols, proof that the mighty United States was vulnerable. For a nation accustomed to exporting images of power, these pictures carried an edge of embarrassment. And yet, amid the frustration, there were flashes of resilience. Families adjusted their routines, combining errands, carpooling with neighbors, and rediscovering bicycles, Some towns organized fuel watches, volunteers phoning in tips about which stations had received deliveries. Children listened to their parents grumble about shortages and learned, perhaps for the first time, that prosperity was not guaranteed. In ways both large and small, the crisis forced adaptation. Still, the psychological toll lingered. Sitting in a gas line was not only tedious, it was a lesson in powerlessness. Every minute spent waiting reminded drivers that forces beyond their control were shaping their lives. The decisions of distant ministers in OPEC, the choices of politicians in Washington, the fluctuations of tankers on the high seasel became painfully personal when the needle on the fuel gauge sank toward empty. The gas lines of 1973 and 1974 endure in memory not because they lasted forever, they did not, but because they punctured the illusion of permanence. They taught Americans that abundance could evaporate overnight, that the conveniences of modern life were fragile, and that even the most ordinary routines, driving to work, dropping children at school, visiting relatives, depended on a resource that could be withheld. For many, that realization stung more than the weight itself. Looking back, one sees in those lines a kind of quiet theater. The cars were actors, the pumps a stage, the drivers an audience both unwilling and unprepared. The play was about dependence, vulnerability, and the limits of control. And the lesson, though delivered with the monotony of idling engines, was unforgettable. If the gas lines were the daily theater of the oil crisis, the media turned them into legend. Photographs of endless queues, headlines screaming about shortages, and nightly television broadcasts made the crisis feel larger than life. In truth, not every gas station was empty. Not every day was chaos. Supplies shifted, some states managed better than others, and deliveries continued even if but the pictures told a simpler, more dramatic story. A superpower brought low by something as ordinary as fuel. The images became unforgettable. Drivers leaning against car doors in wary resignation, children doing homework in back seats while parents waited, policemen directing frustrated crowds as if traffic itself were a protest. Gasoline signs carried messages that felt both absurd and tragic. Sorry, no gas today. Closed until further notice. Or simply limit, 10 gallons. For a country accustomed to neon abundance, these words were shocking. They belonged to an unfamiliar world, one of shortage and vulnerability. Television magnified the drama. Each evening, news anchors delivered the same grim montage, cars stretching for blocks, tempers flaring, and the occasional fistfight caught on film. These were not foreign images from distant wars, but domestic scenes unfolding on American streets. It was a kind of national humiliation, played out in living rooms across the country. The psychological effect was profound. Families began to worry not just about whether they could get gas tomorrow, but about what else might run short. If gasoline could vanish, what about food? What about heat in winter? The crisis gnawed at confidence far more deeply than the shortage itself, and panic, as it always does, fed on itself. People rushed to top off tanks whenever they could, hoarded fuel in cans, and spread rumors of stations about to close or ration coupons soon to arrive. Economists later noted that much of the shortage was created not by the embargo alone, but by the frenzy of consumers reacting to it. But perception mattered more than numbers. In the mind of the public, America was running on empty. Politicians tried to reclaim control of the narrative. Nixon spoke solemnly of conservation, of national resolve, and of eventual independence from foreign oil. Governors explained rationing rules as fair-minded necessity. Yet the public saw only the lines, the empty pumps, and the nightly reports. Confidence, once lost, is hard to restore. What lingered longest was not just the price hikes or the queues, but the sense that modern life was more fragile than anyone had admitted. The car, once a symbol of freedom, now looked like a chain. its promise limited by events in distant deserts. The black and white photographs of 1973 became more than documentation. They became warnings whispered across generations, reminders that abundance is never guaranteed. And perhaps, as you picture those endless lines and hear the murmur of idling engines in your imagination, you feel a little of the unease that Americans felt then, the sense of waiting, of not knowing if the pump would run dry before your turn came. If you're still with me at this quiet point in the story, maybe leave a simple one in the comments. It's our gentle way of knowing you're awake, keeping company in this long journey through history. When the price of oil surged in late 1973, it was not only the gasoline pump that trembled. The entire economy seemed to lurch, as if a stone had been dropped into the center of a vast pond, sending ripples outward in all directions. Every industry that depended on oil, and that meant nearly all of them, felt the shock. Trucks that carried food to supermarkets demanded more expensive fuel. Airlines adjusted their fares, factories raised their costs, and families discovered that heating their homes through winter strained budgets that only months earlier had felt comfortable. Inflation, already present before the embargo, now quickened its pace like a fire suddenly fanned by the wind. For decades, Americans had grown used to a particular rhythm. Prices might rise gently, but wages and growth kept pace. The oil crisis disrupted that rhythm. Instead of prosperity offsetting higher costs, the nation found itself in a paradox. Prices climbed relentlessly, but growth slowed, even stalled. Economists coined a new word for it: stagflation, a condition that had seemed impossible in the old textbooks. The very idea that inflation could coexist with stagnation confounded policymakers. For ordinary people, however, the terminology mattered less than the experience. Groceries cost more. Bills arrived larger, but jobs and paychecks did not grow. In tandem, the chain reaction moved with brutal efficiency. A farmer in Iowa paid more to run his tractor. That cost passed on to the distributor, then to the grocer, and finally to the family buying bread in a suburban store. A factory in Detroit faced higher costs to produce cars, which led to layoffs and more cautious hiring. Trucking firms, squeezed by diesel prices, raised shipping rates, which echoed across the shelves of every department store. Each sector leaned on another, and as oil grew dearer, the strain cascaded through the system. Policymakers tried to contain the fallout with familiar tools. Interest rates were adjusted, price controls lingered, and speeches promised that relief was around the corner. Yet the tools felt blunt against the complexity of the crisis. How do you lower inflation when the very fuel of the economy has quadrupled in price? How do you stimulate growth when businesses are squeezed by costs beyond their control? The formulas of post-war prosperity no longer applied, leaving both economists and politicians groping for answers. Meanwhile, the public felt the squeeze most directly in daily life. Families cut back on vacations, reduced their driving, and postponed large purchases. Dinner table conversations turned to complaints about bills, to worries about jobs, to frustrations at the sense that nothing seemed predictable anymore. The 1970s became a decade defined less by triumph and more by anxiety, a sharp contrast to the optimism of the 1950s and 60s. The oil shock did not create all of these problems, but it acted like a catalyst, exposing vulnerabilities that had been quietly accumulating. The irony was sharp. For years, leaders had spoken of America's boundless energy and unshakable economy. Now, a shortage of fuel revealed just how interdependent and fragile the system really was. The chain reaction from oil to inflation to stagnation showed that modern prosperity was not a fortress but a delicate web. When one strand broke, the whole structure shook. Looking back, it is tempting to see the crisis as inevitable, the natural result of consumption outpacing production. But at the time, it felt like a bewildering descent. The numbers on pay stubs and bills no longer matched, and the dream of steady, predictable progress, the dream that had carried Americans from the post-war boom into the space age, suddenly seemed uncertain. It was as if the future itself had stalled, idling in neutral, waiting for fuel that might not come. If the oil crisis was a slow-motion earthquake for the American economy, the truckers felt the tremors most violently. Long before economists coined neat terms like stagflation, the men and women behind the wheel of 18-wheelers were already living the consequences. Diesel prices soared, deliveries grew erratic, and routes that once turned a steady profit suddenly drained wallets. For independent drivers who lived by the mile, the difference between survival and bankruptcy often came down to the price posted at the pump. The highways of America became stages of protest. In December 1973, angry truckers organized spontaneous strikes, parking their rigs on shoulders and refusing to move. Highways, usually symbols of motion and freedom, transformed into corridors of frustration, with long lines of idled trucks stretching into the horizon. Some drivers blocked toll booths, others gathered in convoys to demand relief from Washington. Their message was simple: without affordable fuel, commerce itself would grind to a halt. The strikes were not without drama. Newspapers carried stories of confrontations between drivers and motorists caught in the logjams. In some states, National Guardsmen were called to maintain order. An extraordinary image of military uniforms on highways built for family vacations and suburban commutes. For a nation already unsettled by war abroad and scandal in Washington, the sight of truckers revolting at home felt like another crack in the facade of stability. Behind the anger lay a genuine desperation. Truckers operated on thin margins, and every cent added to the price of diesel ate into earnings. Many could no longer afford to make long hauls. Goods piled up in warehouses, supermarket shelves thinned, and the public, already strained by rising costs, now saw shortages of everyday products. A carton of milk or a loaf of bread suddenly carried the hidden drama of a supply chain under siege. The protests also exposed how deeply the nation's economy depended on these drivers. In ordinary times, the constant hum of trucks on highways was taken for granted, background noise in a prosperous society. But when the wheels stopped, everyone noticed. Suddenly, the invisible arteries of commerce were laid bare, and Americans realized that without truckers, their stores, gas stations, and factories could not function. The crisis was no longer about distant oil fields or abstract inflation. It was about groceries and goods, about the everyday fabric of life. Washington scrambled to respond. Officials promised hearings, relief packages, and negotiations with oil companies. Nixon himself appealed for patience, urging truckers to return to work for the good of the nation. Yet many drivers felt abandoned, convinced that policymakers in Washington had little understanding of life on the road. The strikes did not last forever, but their echoes lingered. They marked a moment when ordinary workers, caught in the gears of a global crisis, made their voices heard with the only leverage they had: stopping their trucks. There was, in the protests, a certain irony. The highways had been built in the 1950s as monuments to abundance and unity, as arteries of progress binding the nation together. Now those same highways became arenas of paralysis, symbols of how fragile progress could be when fuel dried up. The convoys that rolled in defiance became reminders that the economy was not an abstract machine, but a living network, utterly dependent on energy to keep it moving. For ordinary Americans watching the nightly news, the trucker strikes carried both alarm and empathy. People worried about shortages and disruptions, but many also understood the driver's plight. After all, everyone was feeling the pinch. The truckers simply expressed it with the blunt force of parked rigs and stalled highways. In their struggle, the public saw a reflection of their own frustrations, a sense of being trapped by forces far beyond their control. Looking back, the strikes of 1973 and 1974 were not the longest or most destructive in American history, but they were emblematic of a time when the crisis was not just numbers on a chart, but lived reality on the road. They showed that, when the price of oil soared, it was not only the economy that slowed it, it was the people who kept it moving, forced to push back against a system that no longer seemed to work in their favor. If the highways told one story of paralysis, the factory floors told another. By 1974, the chain reaction of rising oil prices and strikes had reached deep into America's industrial heart. The hum of assembly lines, once the soundtrack of prosperity, began to falter. Plants that had roared with activity in the 1950s and 60s slowed their pace, some shutting down entire shifts, others going dark altogether. The oil crisis did not merely raise costs at the pump. It rippled into every bolt and rivet of the machines that built the modern world. Factories depended on oil, not only for transport but also for production itself. Energy bills soared as plants struggled to heat vast spaces in winter or power heavy machinery. Suppliers raised prices for raw materials, passing on their own fuel costs. Each added burden squeezed companies already struggling with inflation and unpredictable markets. For businesses accustomed to steady growth, the crisis felt like a betrayal. Progress had been promised, but scarcity delivered. In Detroit, the auto industry faced a particularly cruel irony. The very cars that symbolized freedom and fueled demand for oil now sat unsold on lots, their big engines suddenly out of step with anxious consumers. Families that once admired chrome and horsepower began asking nervously about gas mileage. The shift was slow, but it revealed something deeper. The love affair with the automobile was not immune to doubt. Factories that had once thrived on producing ever larger vehicles now cut back, laying off workers who had once believed their jobs were secure for life. Unemployment began to climb. At first, it was scattered temporary layoffs here, shorter work weeks there. But soon the trend became undeniable. By 1974, unemployment reached levels not seen in years, pushing above 7%. For families, the numbers meant far more than statistics. They meant fathers and mothers coming home with worried faces, bills piling on kitchen tables, and difficult conversations about what to sacrifice. The oil shock turned prosperity into anxiety, and the factory floor became the stage where that transformation was most visible. Communities built around industry felt the pain acutely. In steel towns, textile hubs, and auto corridors, local economies contracted as layoffs multiplied. Small businesses that relied on factory workers' diners, shops, service stations struggled in turn. The slowdown spread like a shadow, reminding Americans that their prosperity was interconnected, that when one sector stumbled, many others fell behind. The irony was bitter. The same post-war boom that had built suburban houses, highways, and consumer culture was now unraveling, exposed by a sudden spike in the price of oil. Economists debated the finer points of monetary policy and price controls. But for ordinary citizens, the reality was simple. Jobs were disappearing, costs were rising, and confidence was fading. The political consequences were equally sharp. Unemployment was not merely an economic problem, it was a social one. Families lost not only income, but also identity, pride, and stability. In a nation that prized hard work as the foundation of dignity, layoffs carried a stigma as well as a hardship. The oil crisis did not create every factory closure, but it accelerated trends already at work, pulling the rug from under communities that had trusted in industrial permanence. Looking back, the slowdown of factories during the oil crisis reveals a truth often forgotten. that prosperity rests on delicate balances. It is not enough to have workers, machines, and demand. Without energy, the entire system falters. The engines of production, like the cars idling in gas lines, were chained to the barrel. When that barrel became scarce and costly, the engines sputtered. For Americans of the 1970s, the sight of shuttered plants and rising unemployment was a reminder that abundance could slip away quickly. And for us today, it remains a cautionary tale that an economy is only as strong as the foundations it rests upon, and that even giants stumble when their fuel runs dry. When the oil crisis descended on America, Washington found itself scrambling for solutions that seemed more like improvisations than strategy. Lawmakers who had long promised abundance now debated the unthinkable: rationing, restrictions, and controls. The superpower that had once celebrated open roads and cheap fuel was suddenly considering measures that sounded more at home in wartime Europe than in suburban America. The first weapon in Washington's arsenal was rhetoric. President Richard Nixon appeared on television, urging Americans to conserve energy as if thrift were a patriotic duty. He spoke of dimming lights, turning down thermostats, and driving less, though the advice rang hollow in a country built around the car. It was one thing to suggest walking more in Manhattan, quite another in sprawling suburbs where the nearest grocery store might be miles away. Next came rationing debates. Some states experimented with odd-even systems, where the last digit of a license plate determined the days a driver could buy fuel. The rules were clumsy, sometimes farcical. Families with 2 cars quickly realized they could skirt the restrictions, while those with only one vehicle found themselves stranded on alternate days. Lines at gas stations lengthened anyway, and resentment grew. Yet policymakers insisted that rationing promoted fairness, even as Americans muttered about its inefficiency. Then there was the national speed limit. In January 1974, Nixon signed a law imposing a maximum of 55 miles per hour on highways, the logic being that slower driving saved fuel. It was true enough, but the cultural backlash was swift. Drivers complained of crawling along roads built for speed, truckers resented the delays, and enforcement proved difficult. The number 55 became a national joke, a symbol of government overreach, even though studies later showed that it did save both fuel and lives. The irony was sharp. The same highways once built to showcase progress were now patrolled for restraint. Price controls, too, became a central tool. Nixon had already introduced wage and price freezes in 1971 to combat inflation, and gasoline was no exception. The idea was to shield consumers from sudden surges, but the reality was more complicated. Artificially low prices discouraged production and created distortions in supply. Independent gas stations, unable to compete, sometimes closed altogether. The controls gave the appearance of action, but often worsened the shortages they sought to prevent. Economists complained, drivers grumbled, and the pumps still ran dry. Congress, meanwhile, held hearings that produced more theater than solutions. Senators scolded oil executives, demanding explanations for profits, while executives deflected blame to OPEC and global markets. The spectacle satisfied public anger for a time, but it did little to put fuel in tanks. The hearings exposed the fragility of America's energy system, but offered few remedies. What emerged from Washington's response was less a coherent plan than a patchwork of measures, half symbolic and half practical. Some did achieve results. The speed limit reduced consumption, conservation campaigns raised awareness, and longer-term initiatives began to take shape. But in the short term, the crisis remained acute. Families still queued at gas stations. Truckers still struggled with diesel, and factories still cut back. Washington looked less like the confident conductor of a powerful economy, and more like a harried improviser, fumbling for notes in the middle of a storm. And yet, in its fumbling, Washington revealed something important. The oil crisis was not simply about barrels and prices, it was about identity. To ration fuel, to slow cars, to freeze prices was to admit vulnerability. It forced Americans to confront limits they had never acknowledged. The debates in Congress, the laws passed in haste, and the appeals for patience all testified to a nation learning, reluctantly, that abundance could not be commanded by decree. Looking back, the measures of 1973 and 1974 appear both clumsy and inevitable. Clumsy, because they failed to address the root causes. Inevitable, because no government could ignore the cries of citizens stranded in gas lines. The speed limit signs, the rationing rules, the televised speeches, they were the symbols of an era when prosperity's mask slipped, and fragility stood exposed, while politicians debated and truckers protested. Ordinary families faced the crisis in the intimacy of daily life. The oil shock was not only about statistics and headlines. It was about morning routines, weekly errands, and the quiet recalibration of habits that had once been automatic. For millions of households, coping meant learning to live differently, often with a mixture of frustration, ingenuity, and reluctant humor. Gasoline rationing, whether formal or informal, forced families to plan carefully. Trips to the supermarket, once casual, became strategic. Parents combined errands, mapping routes with precision to avoid waste. Carpooling, once an option, turned into a necessity. Children who had grown used to being driven everywhere began to walk or cycle to school. Teenagers, for whom a driver's license had symbolized freedom, discovered that independence now depended on the family's ability to secure enough fuel. Some joked that it was not horsepower that mattered, but gallons. Schools also felt the pinch. Buses reduced routes or cut back on after-school activities. Heating bills strained budgets during the winter of 1973-74, forcing administrators to make difficult choices. In some districts, classrooms were kept cooler than usual, and students wore sweaters indoors. Field trips were canceled, sports schedules curtailed, and in a few cases, schools shortened their weeks to save on energy costs. The oil crisis seeped into the lives of children, reshaping not only how they traveled, but also how they learned. Communities adapted with their own forms of creativity. Neighbors organized informal ride-sharing groups. Church bulletins carried fuel-saving tips, and local newspapers published columns on efficient driving. The once ignored virtues of small cars suddenly came into fashion. Families that had boasted of big sedans now eyed compact imports from Japan, finding thriftiness newly respectable. Hardware stores, sold out of bicycles, and suburban streets began to see more two-wheelers than ever before. Conservation entered the cultural vocabulary in unexpected ways. Television ran public service announcements urging Americans to turn off lights and lower thermostats. "Don't be foolish," read one slogan, as if humor could soften the sting of scarcity. Some families embraced the challenge, treating it almost like a game, competing to see who could save the most. Others resented it deeply, seeing every conservation effort as a reminder of vulnerability. Either way, the oil crisis touched the rhythms of home as much as the strategies of Washington. There was also a psychological adjustment. For a generation raised in abundance, the idea of limits felt alien. Parents who remembered Depression-era thrift found themselves telling their children, once again, that resources must not be wasted. Young people who had assumed the open road was theirs discovered that freedom could be rationed. The cultural tone shifted subtly. Caution replaced confidence. Patience replaced spontaneity. Even leisure bore the mark of the crisis, as vacations shortened and families sought entertainment closer to home. Not all changes were burdens. Some communities rediscovered forms of solidarity that abundance had eroded. Neighbors who had rarely spoken now coordinated carpools. Families ate more meals at home, rediscovering simple pleasures. Children played closer to their neighborhoods, forming bonds that might never have emerged if gasoline had remained cheap. Hardship, though unwelcome, sometimes produced resilience. Still, the sense of unease lingered. The oil crisis was not just about saving a gallon here or there. It was about the unsettling realization that daily life could be disrupted by forces far beyond anyone's control. That realization left a mark deeper than canceled trips or cooler classrooms. It instilled a humility that abundance had long concealed. Looking back, the adjustments of families, schools, and communities reveal the true depth of the oil shock. It was not merely an economic event, but a cultural turning point, one that reshaped expectations and reminded Americans that modern life was not immune to scarcity. Beneath the frustration and ingenuity lay a quieter truth, that the promise of limitless freedom had always depended on fragile foundations. And so, as engines idled in long lines, and children pulled sweaters tight in chilly classrooms, a nation learned, however reluctantly, that prosperity was not guaranteed. If you stayed with me through these stories of ordinary lives adjusting to extraordinary times, perhaps leave a simple one in the comments. It's a gentle way of knowing you're still awake as we continue down this winding road of history together. By the summer of 1973, even before the embargo struck in full force, President Richard Nixon had sensed that the country's dependence on foreign oil was becoming politically untenable. When the lines at gas stations grew longer and the prices higher, that sense turned into urgency. Americans, accustomed to hearing their leaders boast of strength and self-sufficiency, were suddenly being told that their daily commutes and winter heating bills depended on the goodwill of distant nations. For a president already battered by the Watergate scandal, the prospect of appearing powerless in the face of gas shortages was intolerable. And so Nixon unveiled a bold plan in November 1973, Project Independence. The name itself carried the swagger of a campaign slogan, echoing the spirit of 1776, as if energy policy could be a new declaration of freedom. Nixon promised that by 1980, the United States would be entirely self-sufficient in energy, no longer vulnerable to embargoes or foreign pressure. The language was stirring, the promise dramatic. Yet behind the rhetoric lay a mixture of ambition, desperation, and wishful thinking. The plan called for expanding domestic oil production, ramping up coal use, investing in nuclear power, and encouraging conservation. Nixon spoke of building 1,000 nuclear plants by the year 2000, of drilling more wells at home, of reducing waste at every level of society. He declared that America would summon the same spirit of innovation that had put a man on the moon: energy. Independence, he argued, was not only possible, but inevitable if the nation simply willed it so. The public, weary of waiting in lines, wanted to believe. The idea that shortages could be conquered through determination fit the American story of progress. Newspapers hailed the speech as decisive. Television broadcasts framed it as a turning point, and ordinary citizens took comfort in the thought that the crisis might have an endpoint. In a season of humiliation, Project Independence sounded like hope, yet the obstacles were immense. Domestic oil fields had already peaked in 1970, and no amount of optimism could reverse geology. Nuclear power carried promise, but also controversy with questions of cost, safety, and waste unresolved. Coal was abundant, but its environmental costs were evident even then. Conservation required cultural change, something far harder to legislate than new drilling permits. The plan was ambitious on paper, but fragile in execution. Critics noted that Nixon's timelines were unrealistic, his projections rosy, and his details vague. Some accused him of political theater, using grand promises to distract from the deeper scandals gathering around his presidency. Others saw in Project Independence a sincere attempt to rally the nation, even if its goals were more aspirational than practical. Either way, the project captured the tension of the moment, a nation desperate for control in a world where control was slipping. What makes Project Independence memorable is less its results few of its targets were met than its symbolism. It marked the first time an American president placed energy security at the very center of national strategy. It acknowledged openly that oil was not just a commodity but a vulnerability. It reframed conservation, once considered dull or unpatriotic, as a duty. Even if the specifics faltered, the declaration itself was a turning point. In hindsight, one cannot help but smile at the gap between rhetoric and reality. The United States did not achieve independence by 1980, nor by 1990, nor even by 2000. Decades later, debates over foreign oil and energy security continue. Yet Nixon's bold promise set a precedent. Every president since has, in one form or another, promised energy independence. The phrase has become a staple of American politics, repeated with the same solemnity, as if each generation were the first to imagine it. Project Independence, then, was both a product of its time and a prophecy of the debates to come. It showed how quickly energy could move from background to foreground, from a matter of markets to a matter of national destiny. And it illustrated how leaders, faced with scarcity, turn to the language of revolution, even when the revolution they propose is built on fragile foundations. If Project Independence was Nixon's soaring promise of freedom, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was the quieter, more practical acknowledgement of vulnerability. Announced in the mid-1970s and formally established in 1975, the reserve was conceived as a vast underground insurance policy, caverns of crude oil stored away in case the world once again turned hostile. For a country shaken by the gas lines of 1973, the idea carried a reassuring simplicity. If the pumps ran dry, Washington would have its own secret stash, ready to pour back into the veins of the economy. The scale of the project was ambitious. Engineers identified enormous salt domes along the Gulf Coast formations, created by nature's slow patience over millions of years, and began hollowing them out to create storage caverns. Each dome could hold millions of barrels of oil, invisible from the surface, yet capable of sustaining the nation in times of crisis. To some, the idea seemed almost biblical, stockpiling reserves against the lean years, like Joseph advising Pharaoh in ancient Egypt. For Americans still haunted by the sight of endless gas lines, it sounded like wisdom at last. But even insurance has its limits. At full capacity, the reserve could hold hundreds of millions of barrels, enough to buy time, but not to rewrite the fundamentals of dependence. The United States consumed so much oil each day that the stockpile, impressive as it was, amounted to weeks or months rather than years of protection. It was a cushion, not a cure. Yet politically, that cushion mattered. It allowed presidents to assure the public that never again would the nation be left helpless in the face of embargoes. The creation of the reserve also revealed how deeply energy had become entwined with national security. For decades, oil policy had been framed in economic terms: prices, production, profits. After 1973, it was framed in strategic ones. Oil was no longer just fuel. It was power, leverage even, survival. To guard it was as essential as guarding borders or arsenals. The reserve itself was placed under the Department of Energy when that agency was created in 1977, reflecting its new status as a matter of national defense. Critics, of course, saw ironies everywhere. The same government that once dismissed concerns about dependence was now literally burying oil underground in case of future shocks. Some asked whether it might have been wiser to invest in reducing demand rather than stockpiling supply. Others noted that the reserve could not prevent crises, only softened their blow. And a few wry commentators joked that America had finally admitted its addiction, building a giant basement stash, like a compulsive hoarder, unwilling to face change. Still, the reserve endured, and over the decades it would be tapped during wars, hurricanes, and market disruptions. Each time, it served as both a practical tool and a political symbol. Proof that lessons of 1973 had not been entirely forgotten. It reminded Americans that energy security required preparation, that complacency carried risks, and that vulnerability was never entirely banished, only managed. Looking back, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve illustrates a paradox at the heart of the oil crisis. On one hand, it was a bold step, a recognition that energy must be safeguarded as carefully as any arsenal. On the other, it was a concession, an admission that independence was an illusion, and that the nation would remain tied to global oil markets for the foreseeable future. The reserve did not deliver freedom, it delivered a buffer, a little breathing room in a world that no longer promised abundance. And perhaps that was its quiet wisdom. Independence might have been an inspiring slogan, but resilience was a more achievable goal. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve embodied that shift, from dreams of absolute control to the pragmatism of preparation. It was not glamorous, and it did not erase the memory of gas lines, but it gave the nation a measure of confidence, a reminder that even in scarcity, foresight could provide a margin of safety. While engineers were hollowing out salt domes for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, diplomats were wading through an equally complex terrain, the fragile alliances and rivalries of the Middle East. At the center of this diplomatic chessboard stood Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, whose reputation as a master strategist was put to the test in the autumn of 1973. For Kissinger, the embargo was not just about barrels of oil, it was about the balance of global power, the survival of American credibility, and the delicate architecture of Cold War politics. The challenge was formidable. The Arab members of OPEC were united by anger over American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Their embargo was designed to punish, to force a recalibration of U.S. policy in the region. For Washington, accustomed to dictating terms, the experience of being dictated to was jarring. Kissinger understood that breaking the embargo required more than economic fixes. It demanded diplomacy at the highest level. Saudi Arabia was the key. Among the producers, it held the largest reserves and the greatest influence. If Riyadh could be persuaded to moderate its stance, the embargo might weaken. Kissinger courted the Saudis with a mixture of flattery, pressure, and promises. He emphasized America's role as a stabilizing force, hinted at long-term cooperation, and sought to reassure King Faisal that US support for Israel would not mean permanent disregard for Arab concerns. It was a delicate dance, to offer enough to keep the Saudis engaged without alienating Israel or appearing to capitulate. Meetings stretched late into the night, with Kissinger deploying his characteristic blend of patience and gravitas. He spoke not only of oil but of global security, framing Saudi cooperation as essential to stability in a world already fractured by superpower rivalries. To the Saudis, who had long felt marginalized, this recognition carried weight. They relished the new role of power brokers, courted not just for their faith or culture, but for their geology. Yet diplomacy was never simple. Other Arab producers pressed for continued unity, warning Riyadh not to betray the cause. Domestic opinion in Saudi Arabia leaned heavily toward solidarity with Egypt and Syria. King Faisal himself was deeply religious and wary of appearing too close to the West. Kissinger had to maneuver carefully, offering assurances without demanding public concessions, building trust in increments rather than sweeping declarations. Gradually, cracks began to appear in the embargo. Some European nations distanced themselves from U.S. policy to secure their own supplies. Japan shifted its diplomatic stance, recognizing the new power of Arab producers. For Washington, these moves were troubling, yet they also revealed the fragility of the embargo's unity. By early 1974, the pressure of lost revenues, combined with Kissinger's quiet diplomacy, began to tilt the balance. Saudi Arabia signaled its willingness to restore flows under certain conditions, and the embargo's grip loosened. Kissinger later framed the crisis as proof that energy and diplomacy were inseparable. The embargo had demonstrated that America could no longer treat the Middle East as peripheral. It was now central to global stability. The shuttle diplomacy he conducted, flying from capital to capital, negotiating ceasefires, and coaxing oil back into pipelines, became legendary. Part of the myth of Kissinger as a master tactician. Yet even he admitted that the crisis revealed a vulnerability no strategy could erase. America's dependence on a resource it did not control. For the public, these diplomatic maneuvers were mostly invisible. What they saw were the gas lines, the rationing rules, the speeches on television. But behind those images, Kissinger and his counterparts were redrawing the map of power, laying the groundwork for decades of U.S.-Saudi cooperation. The partnership that emerged oil for security. Security for oil would shape not only energy markets, but geopolitics well into the 21st century. There is a certain irony in this outcome. The embargo, meant to weaken America, instead bound it more tightly to the Middle East. The very act of punishment elevated Saudi Arabia from a regional player to a global pivot. Kissinger, with his blend of charm and calculation, managed to ease the immediate crisis. But he also entrenched a dependency that future presidents would wrestle with long after 1973 had faded into history. The oil embargo of 1973 did more than raise prices or lengthen gas lines. It shifted the very balance of power in the global economy. For decades, the industrialized nations of the West had assumed that their wealth and military strength ensured control over the world's most vital resources. Oil-producing countries were treated as suppliers, not decision-makers, their geology more important than their diplomacy. But the crisis overturned this hierarchy. Suddenly, ministers from Riyadh, Kuwait City, and Tripoli held the world's attention, their decisions capable of rattling stock markets in New York and London. OPEC, once dismissed as a fragile coalition of squabbling nations, now stood as a force that could humble even the most powerful economies. Its newfound authority was not theoretical. It was demonstrated in the daily lives of ordinary citizens in the United States, Europe, and Japan. The superpowers, locked in their Cold War rivalry, discovered that their tanks and missiles were useless against barrels withheld at port. Energy, not ideology, dictated the pace of life. In a sense, the oil shock marked the arrival of a multipolar world, one where power flowed not only from Washington and Moscow, but also from the desert kingdoms and republics of the Middle East. Psychological effect in the West was profound. For years, commentators had described producer nations as dependent, reliant on Western technology and markets. Now, the tables were turned. It was the West that scrambled to appease, to negotiate, even to beg. Editorial cartoons captured the irony, depicting American drivers chained to OPEC oil barrels, or Uncle Sam queuing at the pump, while oil sheiks looked on with bemused smiles. Beneath the satire lay a sharp truth. The monopoly on influence had shifted, and it would not shift back easily. For OPEC states, the moment was intoxicating. Revenues poured in as prices quadrupled, transforming dusty capitals into modern cities almost overnight. Dubai, Riyadh, and Kuwait City began to sprout, skyscrapers, highways, and gleaming airports. Governments invested in ambitious development projects, buying fleets of airplanes, commissioning universities, and importing consumer goods in staggering quantities. Two leaders who had long endured Western condescension. The wealth felt like vindication, proof that their resources commanded respect at last. Yet power brought dilemmas. The same revenues that enriched treasuries also created new dependencies. OPEC economies, flush with cash, became tied to imports for food, technology, and labor. Their new authority in global politics came with new expectations, and not every state was equally capable of managing the windfall. Some invested wisely, others squandered fortunes. Still, the shared experience of flexing collective muscle forged a new identity. Oil producers were no longer pawns, they were players. For Washington and its allies, the rise of OPEC forced a rethinking of strategy. Energy security became as central as military alliances. Diplomatic overtures to the Middle East intensified, with arms deals and promises of protection offered in exchange for steady flows of crude. The US-Saudi relationship, in particular, deepened into a partnership that would shape the geopolitics of the next half-century. America's foreign policy, once focused on containing communism, now carried a new imperative. Securing oil supplies, the global balance also tilted in subtler ways. Developing nations outside OPEC watched closely, inspired by the success of producer solidarity. If oil states could rewrite the terms of trade, why not others with minerals, crops, or water? The rhetoric of the new international economic order gained traction as the 1970s became a decade of challenges to Western dominance. The oil crisis was not just about fuel, it was about the redistribution of power in a world no longer content with post-war hierarchies. Looking back, the authority OPEC wielded in the 1970s was fleeting, eroded later by internal divisions, new discoveries, and shifts in demand. Yet the shock of 1973 left an enduring legacy. The recognition that resources could reorder geopolitics as surely as armies. The memory of that moment still lingers in policy debates, in the constant refrain of energy independence, and in the unspoken acknowledgement that prosperity is never insulated from vulnerability. The world learned in 1973 that power could rest not only on weapons or factories, but on the decision of a handful of ministers gathered in Vienna. That lesson, once absorbed, could not be forgotten. In the wake of the oil crisis, America faced an uncomfortable truth. The dream of endless cheap fuel had vanished, and something would have to change. While presidents promised independence and diplomats brokered fragile deals, ordinary citizens and policymakers alike began to consider alternatives. Conservation, once a word reserved for environmentalists, centered the mainstream vocabulary. The oil shock turned what had seemed eccentric into common sense, even patriotic duty. Television campaigns urged Americans to save energy with slogans that bordered on the whimsical: turn off unused lights, lower thermostats, combine errands. Car manufacturers, long obsessed with horsepower, started advertising miles per gallon. Compact Japanese imports like Toyota and Honda, once niche curiosities, found a receptive market in Americans suddenly anxious about fuel efficiency. The oil crisis, in its perverse way, opened the door for foreign automakers to gain a lasting foothold in the U.S. market. At the policy level, Washington launched new initiatives aimed at reducing dependence on oil. The Energy Reorganization Act of 1974 laid the groundwork for the Department of Energy, a signal that energy policy had become a central pillar of governance. Funding for research into solar, wind, and geothermal energy increased, though the sums paled in comparison to subsidies for oil and coal. Nuclear power, too, was touted as a cornerstone of a diversified future. Nixon's earlier vision of 1,000 nuclear plants by 2000 was never realized, but the era did witness a genuine, if uneven, push toward atomic energy. Conservation extended to infrastructure as well. Cities explored public transportation projects, some reviving old streetcar lines, others investing in subways and buses. The message was clear. A society built entirely on private automobiles could no longer be assumed. Though progress was halting and often resisted, the conversation had shifted. To suggest alternatives to driving was no longer a fringe idea, but a serious policy discussion. Schools and universities, too, became laboratories for new thinking. Campus experiments tested solar panels, wind turbines, and energy-efficient building designs, environmental consciousness. Already stirring in the early 1970s with the first Earth Day, found fresh urgency in the oil crisis. Students who had marched against war now demanded renewable energy. The counterculture's critique of consumerism suddenly aligned, however briefly, with the government's plea for restraint. Yet change was never easy. Many Americans chafed at the call for sacrifice, seeing conservation as a limitation rather than liberation. Big cars still held cultural sway, coal remained abundant, and oil retained its grip on daily life. The move toward alternatives was real, but partial, more a gesture than a revolution. The crisis spurred awareness, but awareness alone could not overturn decades of habit and infrastructure. Still, the seeds were planted. The 1970s witnessed the birth of solar startups, the growth of environmental advocacy, and the slow recognition that the future could not be fueled by oil alone. It was a beginning, fragile and uneven, but a beginning nonetheless. The irony of the oil crisis is that, while it exposed America's dependence, it also expanded imagination. Scarcity forced people to consider possibilities once dismissed as impractical. The very discomfort of the crisis gave rise to conversations that would echo decades later. As climate change and renewable energy came to dominate headlines. In that sense, the oil shock was not just a disruption, it was an education. Looking back, the early moves toward conservation and alternatives in the 1970s were tentative, even clumsy. Yet they marked the start of a long journey. They showed that abundance could no longer be assumed, that resilience required adaptation, and that even small changes a thermostat turned down, a compact car purchased could ripple outward into culture and policy. And perhaps, as we picture those first solar panels glinting on rooftops, or those compact cars humming quietly past gas lines, we can hear the faint whisper of a new future stirring beneath the old. If you've stayed awake with me through this chapter of strained promises, cautious experiments, and fragile beginnings, perhaps leave a simple one in the comments. It's our calm way of knowing you're still here, walking alongside history's winding road. The oil crisis did not end with the turning of a calendar page. Even after the embargo lifted in March 1974, its effects lingered in American life, quietly reshaping habits in ways both subtle and profound. Scarcity and high prices had forced families, businesses, and communities to adapt. And though many were eager to return to normal, the definition of normal itself had shifted. Consumer habits, once anchored in abundance, began to adjust to a new world of limits. One of the most visible changes was in the automobile market. For decades, American car makers had competed by building bigger, faster, and more powerful machines. Gas mileage was an afterthought. Style and muscle ruled the showroom floor. But the crisis disrupted this logic. Suddenly, buyers began asking about efficiency, about miles per gallon. Compact cars once considered underpowered or unglamorous found new appeal. Imports from Japan, particularly Toyota and Honda, surged in popularity. Their smaller engines and frugal fuel use matched the anxieties of the age, and their reputation for reliability sealed the deal. Detroit, long dominant, was caught flat-footed, struggling to adapt to a demand it had not anticipated. Households, too, adjusted their daily routines. Families that once thought nothing of multiple errands in a day began to consolidate trips. Vacations shifted closer to home, with fewer long road journeys and more local excursions. Some families rediscovered old pastimes, picnics in nearby parks, board games at home, partly out of thrift, partly out of necessity. The glamour of constant motion dimmed, replaced by a quieter rhythm of living within reach. Energy conservation crept into domestic life in other ways as well. Thermostats were nudged lower in winter and higher in summer. Sweaters became part of indoor attire. Parents taught children to turn off lights, to avoid leaving appliances running, to be mindful of waste. These lessons, small in themselves, accumulated into a cultural shift. Thrift regained respectability. To save energy was no longer a quirk, it was a virtue. Grocery shopping bore the mark of the crisis, too. Rising transportation costs meant higher prices on food, and families became more careful about purchases. Bulk buying grew popular, as did discount outlets. Coupons were clipped with fresh zeal, and kitchen gardens enjoyed a modest revival. Magazines published tips for stretching dollars in meals, as if frugality were suddenly fashionable again. Scarcity had turned the act of buying into a more conscious exercise. Even leisure reflected the new awareness. The surge of bicycle sales during the crisis did not entirely fade. Many Americans discovered the simple pleasure of two wheels. Jogging, walking, and neighborhood play gained ground as alternatives to gas-driven outings. The oil crisis, though, born of frustration, inadvertently seeded a culture of fitness and localism that would echo into later decades. There was, of course, resistance. Many Americans longed to return to the comforts of excess, to trade and thrift for horsepower as soon as prices eased. And indeed, consumer culture has a way of rebounding quickly. Yet something had shifted permanently in the collective memory. The experience of waiting in gas lines, of budgeting for fuel, of watching prices climb with no end in sight. These memories acted like a warning sign tucked away in the national psyche. Even when abundance returned, it was haunted by the awareness that it could vanish again. Looking back, the reshaping of consumer habits after 1973 was not a revolution, but a recalibration. Families learned to plan, businesses learned to adapt, and a culture that had long equated bigger with better learned, if only briefly, that smaller could be wiser. The habits of the crisis years, forged in discomfort, became the quiet scaffolding on which new expectations were built. The oil crisis had revealed vulnerability, but it had also revealed resilience. Americans could adjust, if reluctantly, to new conditions. They could discover thrift in place of extravagance, efficiency in place of waste. And though they would not always keep these habits, the memory of them lingered, shaping choices in ways not always visible, but always present. If the oil crisis had been a storm, Americans might have hoped that the clouds would clear quickly once the embargo ended in 1974. But what lingered over the economy was not a sudden downpour, but a damp, lingering fog called stagflation. It was a word that seemed awkward at first, coined by economists who had to admit that their neat theories had been broken. Inflation was supposed to mean growth. Stagnation was supposed to mean falling prices. The 1970s offered the worst of both, at once soaring costs and slowing output. A contradiction that textbooks had declared impossible. For ordinary families, stagflation was not an abstract puzzle, but a daily burden. Prices rose on groceries, clothes, and fuel, yet wages lagged behind. Paychecks stretched less and less far, and the little luxuries of middle-class life, new furniture, a summer trip, even a night out, suddenly felt out of reach. Unemployment crept upward, leaving families with the cruel combination of rising bills and shrinking incomes. The American dream, which had seemed so automatic in the 1950s and 60s, now looked like something that might require sacrifice, even luck. Factories that had slowed during the oil shock did not quickly recover. Many industries struggled with higher costs, and some found themselves uncompetitive against foreign rivals. Japanese car makers, lean and efficient, gained ground, while American giants stumbled. In steel, textiles, and consumer goods, the story was the same. Rising costs met falling demand, and workers bore the consequences. Layoffs and wage freezes turned towns once built on industry into communities of anxiety. Washington groped for solutions, but the usual tools failed. Raising interest rates curbed growth without halting inflation. Spending programs boosted demand but pushed prices higher. The Federal Reserve, once confident in its ability to manage prosperity, looked less like a master conductor and more like a weary juggler, dropping pins. Presidents Ford and Carter both struggled to tame the crisis, offering programs with hopeful acronyms. Win-whip inflation now buttons appeared on lapels in 1974, but none provided real relief. The buttons soon became punchlines, a symbol of Washington's impotence in the face of a problem it could not define, let alone solve. For society at large, stagflation bred frustration and disillusionment. The confidence of the post-war boom gave way to a kind of national malaise. Polls showed declining trust in government, falling optimism about the future, and rising cynicism about leadership. To be told that the crisis was under control while standing in a grocery store with higher bills and lighter bags was a recipe for skepticism. The oil crisis had shaken the economy, but stagflation eroded faith. Children growing up in the 1970s absorbed the mood in subtle ways. They heard parents argue about budgets, saw factories close in their towns, and noticed that politicians' promises rang hollow. For them, the decade carried a different texture than the bright optimism of the 1950s or the turbulent idealism of the 1960s. It was marked instead by uncertainty, by the nagging sense that the future might not deliver more than the past. Historians often describe the 1970s as an era of limits, and stagflation was its economic face. The combination of scarcity, inflation, and stagnation stripped away illusions of automatic growth. It reminded Americans that prosperity could falter, that global forces could reshape domestic life, and that no nation, however wealthy, was immune to vulnerability. Looking back, stagflation was not merely an economic condition, but a cultural one. It seeped into attitudes, dampened expectations, and made caution the default mood. It was a slow-burning crisis, less dramatic than the sudden embargo, but more enduring. If the oil shock was a jolt, stagflation was the hangover, a long, weary ache that refused to go away by the end of the decade. Americans might have hoped that the memory of 1973 would fade into history. Another trial endured and overcome, but history, with its dry sense of humor, had other plans. In 1979, the oil crisis returned, this time under President Jimmy Carter, and the nation was forced to relive a haunting repetition of the same nightmare. The trigger was different, the Iranian Revolution rather than the Yom Kippur War, but the results were uncannily familiar. Scarcity, long lines at gas stations, soaring prices, and a renewed sense of helplessness. The Iranian upheaval toppled Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a longtime U.S. ally whose country had been one of the world's major oil exporters. As revolution swept the streets of Tehran, production plummeted, and markets panicked. Even before barrels stopped flowing, fear alone was enough to send prices climbing. In a global system already strained by rising demand and fragile supply lines, the disruption proved devastating. Oil prices doubled, and once again, Americans found themselves circling blocks in search of gasoline. A familiar echo of 6 years earlier, but this time sharpened by accumulated frustration. For Carter, the timing could not have been worse. His presidency, already weighed down by inflation, unemployment, and foreign policy troubles, now faced the indignity of another energy crisis. In July 1979, he delivered what came to be known as the Malaise speech, though he never used the word itself. Carter spoke somberly about a crisis of confidence, telling Americans that the problem was not just oil, but a deeper erosion of spirit. The speech was earnest, even prophetic in its recognition of cultural fatigue. But many citizens heard only a lecture at a moment when they craved reassurance. Instead of comfort, they felt chastised. The repetition was exasperating. Once again, cars sat in endless queues. Once again, tempers flared at pumps. Once again, odd-even rationing systems reappeared, and police were dispatched to keep order. The public, already weary from a decade of stagflation, greeted the sight not with stoicism, but with near despair. To endure such shortages once could be chalked up to misfortune. To endure them twice suggested that the nation was trapped in a cycle it could not escape. Culturally, the second oil shock deepened the gloom of the 1970s. The decade that had begun, with promises of adjustment after the turbulence of the 1960s, ended instead with exhaustion. Americans grew skeptical, not only of their leaders, but of their own assumptions about prosperity. Conversations that had once revolved around growth now lingered on decline. The oil shocks became symbols of a broader unease, that the future might not always deliver more, that progress was not inevitable, that limits were real. And yet, even amid frustration, adaptation continued. Smaller, fuel-efficient cars gained even more traction. Public interest in renewable energy surged. Solar panels, still primitive by modern standards, appeared on rooftops, encouraged by tax credits. Carter himself had panels installed on the White House roof, a symbolic gesture that many mocked at the time, but which later generations would recall as far-sighted. The crisis did not produce a sudden transformation, but it reinforced the lesson of 1973. Dependence on foreign oil carried costs that could no longer be dismissed. The 1979 shock also reshaped geopolitics. The revolution in Iran severed one of America's key energy partnerships, while turmoil in the region emboldened OPEC once again. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan later that year only added to the sense of instability, convincing many Americans that the world was spiraling beyond their control. The oil barrel, once invisible in daily life, had become a constant reminder of vulnerability, sitting at the intersection of politics, economics, and culture. Looking back, the second oil crisis was not merely a repeat performance, but an intensification. It compounded the economic malaise, eroded confidence further, and set the stage for political change. The frustrations of high prices and empty pumps became one of the forces propelling Ronald Reagan to victory in 1980. With his promise of renewal and strength, the irony is unmistakable. Energy shortages, born of scarcity, reshaped not only economies, but presidencies. In the end, the haunting repetition of 1979 confirmed what 1973 had already taught: that modern prosperity was built on fragile foundations. The return of the crisis made the lesson unavoidable. Oil was not simply a commodity, it was a force that could humble nations. And until that dependence was broken, Americans would remain vulnerable to events far beyond their borders. The oil shocks of the 1970s were not only crises of their moment, they were warnings written in bold across history's pages. Though decades have passed, the lessons of those years echo into the 21st century with surprising clarity. At their heart, they remind us that energy is never just a commodity. It is security, vulnerability, and power all at once. Nations that ignore this truth do so at their peril. The first lesson is the danger of dependence. The United States in 1973 had built an economy on the assumption that oil would always be cheap and abundant. When that assumption collapsed, so too did confidence. Today, The same risk looms for any country that leans too heavily on a single resource or supplier. Europe discovered this painfully in the 2020s, as geopolitical conflicts revealed the fragility of reliance on imported gas. The pattern is familiar. When energy is concentrated, it becomes a lever of power, and those who control it can dictate terms to those who do not. The second lesson is the importance of resilience. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, conservation campaigns, and early renewable initiatives were imperfect, even clumsy, but they represented attempts to build buffers against uncertainty. In the 21st century, resilience means more than stockpiles. It means diversification. Solar farms, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and smart grids are modern echoes of the 1970s first cautious steps toward alternatives. They are born not only from environmental concern, but also from the memory of vulnerability, understanding that true independence lies in flexibility, not in illusions of endless supply. The third lesson is that crises accelerate change. Before 1973, efficiency was a niche interest. Afterward, it became a cultural necessity. In our own time, the shocks of climate change, pandemics, and geopolitical strife may serve the same role. They force societies to imagine alternatives that once seemed distant. Just as Americans in the 1970s discovered the value of compact cars and sweaters worn indoors. Today's challenges push us toward rethinking what prosperity looks like. Perhaps comfort lies not in consuming more, but in consuming wisely. The fourth lesson is political. Leaders who fail to respond convincingly to energy crises often pay the price. Nixon, Ford, Carter were judged harshly in part because of their inability to tame fuel shortages and stagflation. In democracies, empty gas pumps and rising prices are not merely inconveniences. They are symbols of government weakness. In authoritarian states, they can fuel unrest and even revolution. As Iran demonstrated in 1979, energy, in short, shapes not only markets, but the fate of regimes. Finally, there is the lesson of humility. The 1970s taught Americans that prosperity rests on fragile foundations, that abundance is not guaranteed, and that even a superpower can be humbled by scarcity. This humility, uncomfortable though it may be, remains essential today. As new technologies emerge and renewable energy expands, the temptation will be to believe once again in permanence. But history whispers otherwise. Every system has limits. Every abundance can falter, and every society must be prepared to adapt. And so the story of the oil shocks is not just about the 1970s. It is about us. When we talk about energy wars in the Middle East, about the race for rare earth minerals, about debates over pipelines and climate policies, we are living in the long shadow of 1973. The lessons remain the same. Diversify, conserve, prepare, and never take abundance for granted. Perhaps the most enduring irony is that scarcity often sparks imagination. The black and white photos of gas lines, so grim at the time, now look like the birth pangs of a new era, one in which energy could no longer be treated as invisible. They remind us that discomfort can provoke creativity, that constraint can awaken possibilities. Out of crisis comes vision if we are willing to see it. The oil crises of the 1970s were not the last, nor will they be. But their lessons endure, written in the headlines of the past and the challenges of the present. They tell us that energy is never just fuel. It is the story of who holds power, who feels vulnerable, and who adapts. Half a century later, the oil crisis of the 1970s still lingers in American memory, like a scar that never fully fades. Even those too young to have lived through it can recognize the images. Cars snaking around city blocks, hand-painted signs reading, "No gas today." Weary drivers staring through windshields with a mix of frustration and disbelief. These snapshots have become part of the nation's cultural archive, pulled out whenever fuel prices rise or foreign conflicts threaten supply. The oil crisis is no longer just history, it is a touchstone, a shorthand for vulnerability and dependence. Culturally, its imprint is subtle but enduring. The shift toward smaller, more efficient cars, once born of necessity, became a permanent thread in American consumer habits. Though the allure of SUVs and trucks returned in later decades, the idea that efficiency mattered never disappeared. Popular culture, too, absorbed the mood of the 1970s. Films, novels, and even music carried undertones of disillusionment, shaped in part by the sense that progress was not guaranteed. The oil shocks joined Vietnam and Watergate as symbols of a nation learning humility the hard way. Politically, the memory has been even more potent. Every president since Nixon has promised some form of energy independence, echoing the rhetoric of Project Independence, even as reality proved more complex. Policies ranging from the creation of the Department of Energy to subsidies for renewables to military entanglements in the Middle East can all trace their lineage to the lessons of 1973. The very phrase, energy security, entered the vocabulary in those years and never left. The oil crisis also shapes how Americans interpret new challenges. When hurricanes disrupt supply chains, when global conflicts raise fuel prices, when debates flare over pipelines or climate policies, the ghost of the 1970s hovers in the background. Policymakers know that shortages are not just economic, they are political dynamite. Citizens know, instinctively, that scarcity can upend daily life faster than most other crises. The images of 1973 remain ready to be recalled, fueling arguments, warnings, and campaign promises. In communities, the memory survives in quieter ways. Older generations tell stories of waiting in lines, of neighbors carpooling, of thermostats turned down in chilly winters. These stories become family lore, passed down as cautionary tales about thrift and vulnerability. For some, the crisis sparked lifelong habits of conservation, turning off lights, driving modest cars, planning trips carefully. For others, it left a residue of skepticism, a belief that government promises of abundance should never be trusted too easily. The cultural weight of the crisis also extends beyond the United States, across Europe, Japan, and beyond. The 1970s oil shock is remembered as a turning point that forced nations to rethink energy policy. It spurred investment in nuclear power in France, efficiency standards in Japan, and long-term diversification in many economies. The global energy landscape today still reflects those choices, shaped in response to the fear and urgency of that decade. Perhaps the deepest legacy, however, lies in the psychological shift. The oil crisis punctured the post-war illusion of invincibility. It revealed that modern life, with all its conveniences, was fragile. It showed that even the strongest nations could be humbled by scarcity, and that prosperity was never as automatic as it seemed. That realization, sobering, unwelcome, but ultimately instructive, still colors the way Americans think about energy, security, and the future. Looking back, the oil crisis of the 1970s was more than an episode of high prices and empty pumps. It was a national lesson in vulnerability, a cultural moment of reckoning, and a political catalyst whose ripples stretch into the present. Its memory endures not because of nostalgia, but because it revealed truths that remain relevant. That abundance is fragile, that dependence is dangerous, and that resilience requires foresight. And if you're still with me, reflecting quietly on these echoes of the past and their grip on our present, perhaps leave a simple one in the comments. It's a gentle way of showing that you're still awake, traveling with me through the long corridors of history where memory and lesson intertwine. As the long shadows of the 1970s stretch across memory, it is tempting to think of the oil crisis as a relic of a distant age of black and white photograph tucked away in a family album. A story your parents or grandparents might tell about. The time they waited in line for hours just to buy 10 gallons of gas, yet to see it only as the past would be to miss its enduring whisper, the way it still curls around the present, shaping the choices we make and the fears we nurse in quiet moments. The oil shock was not simply about scarcity. It was about fragility, about the humbling of a society that believed itself untouchable, and about the lessons that linger when the engines fall silent. The story began in abundance. Post-war America brimmed with confidence, fueled by cheap oil and steady growth. The car was not just a machine, but a symbol of freedom. The suburb, not just a residence, but a promise that comfort and motion could coexist forever. Yet beneath that, confidence lay dependence, a reliance on barrels drawn from faraway deserts. When war erupted in the Middle East in 1973, the illusion collapsed. Gas lines stretched across neighborhoods, inflation clawed at paychecks, and the very rhythm of daily life faltered. America discovered that its prosperity was tethered to decisions made in rooms thousands of miles away, decisions over which it had little control. The crisis revealed truths that textbooks had hidden. Economists coined new words like stagflation to describe what had once been considered impossible. Rising prices coupled with stagnating growth. Policymakers improvised rationing fuel, imposing speed limits, creating reserves as if fumbling in the dark for a light switch. Truckers parked their rigs in protest. Factories slowed their hum. Families bundled in sweaters while thermostats dipped lower. The shock was not just at the pump, but in the psyche. For the first time since World War II, Americans learned that abundance was not guaranteed, that the open road could narrow, that the future might not always deliver more, even after the embargo lifted in March 1974. The sense of vulnerability remained. It lingered in the second shock of 1979, when revolution in Iran cut supplies and the familiar cues returned. It persisted in the rhetoric of presidents who promised independence, in the policies that sought alternatives, in the cultural shifts that made conservation a household word. The oil crisis was not a single event, but a turning point, one that reshaped memory, politics, and culture long after the gas lines disappeared. And here we are, in 2025, 52 years later, still living in its shadow. The details are different, but the echoes are unmistakable. Energy debates dominate headlines once more. Inflation, after decades of slumber, has reawakened in new guises. Global conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East remind us that resources remain entangled with politics, that markets can tremble at the sound of distant artillery. Renewable energy surges forward, yet dependence remains. Whether on lithium for batteries or semiconductors for smart grids, the stage has changed, but the play feels familiar. In America today, the lessons of 1973 are not abstractions. They are visible in the push for electric vehicles, in the expansion of wind and solar, in the rhetoric of leaders who once again promise independence. They are present in debates about climate change, about whether the pursuit of abundance can be squared with the limits of the planet. The questions are larger now, framed not just in terms of barrels and miles per gallon, but in terms of survival on a warming globe. Yet at their core, they are the same questions posed by the crisis of the 1970s. How do we balance desire with reality, freedom with restraint, prosperity with vulnerability? The oil crisis also offers perspective on our current anxieties. In 1973, families feared that the American way of life might collapse under the weight of scarcity. Today, fears revolve around climate catastrophe, automation, and political division. Both eras remind us that certainty is fragile, that stability can falter overnight. Yet both also reveal resilience. Americans did adapt. They carpooled, they conserved, they bought smaller cars, they endured. They discovered, often begrudgingly, that limits could be lived with. In that discovery lies hope for our own uncertain future. What the crisis teaches, more than anything, is humility. The abundance of the mid-20th century fostered a belief that growth was inevitable, that progress was a straight line forward. The oil shocks shattered that illusion, teaching that prosperity is not a birthright, but a fragile balance. That humility remains essential today, as we confront challenges that dwarf the oil crisis in scale. It reminds us that dependence is dangerous, but that foresight, conservation, and creativity can soften even the hardest blows. And there is another lesson. Softer, but no less important. Crisis can seed imagination. Out of the discomfort of the 1970s came investments in renewables, conservation, and efficiency, small steps that seemed modest then, but paved the way for the energy transitions of today. Scarcity, for all its pain, sparked vision. Perhaps the same will be true in our time. Perhaps the very pressures that now seem overwhelming will push us to imagine futures we might otherwise ignore. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but it does hum with familiar chords. The oil shocks remind us that we have been humbled before, and we will be humbled again. Yet they also remind us that we have endured, adapted, and even grown wiser in the process. The images of cars lined up at gas stations, of families adjusting thermostats, of presidents delivering solemn speeches, are reminders that vulnerability does not equal defeat. Fragility can coexist with resilience, scarcity with ingenuity. So tonight, as you reflect on the long lines of 1973 and the echoes that reach into 2025, let the lessons settle gently. We cannot control every storm, but we can prepare for the rain. We cannot guarantee abundance, but we can cultivate resilience. And we cannot erase vulnerability, but we can embrace humility. Learning that strength often lies not in pretending to be invincible, but in adapting when the road narrows. The oil crisis was a story of scarcity, but it is also a story of survival. It is proof that even when engines sputter and tempers flare, societies can adjust, can endure, can imagine anew. That is the hope it offers us now, that the crises of our own time, daunting though they seem, may yet yield resilience, vision, and perhaps even wisdom. And if you've stayed awake with me through this journey from the highways of 1973 to the debates of 2025, then thank you. Your presence here, your willingness to walk through history's winding corridors, is itself a small act of resilience. If you found comfort or perspective in this story, I invite you to gently like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're still awake, perhaps leave a simple one below. It's our quiet signal to one another that even in the stillness of night, we travel together through the lessons of the past. Good night, and may history's echoes guide us not into fear, but into hope.